very lucky to have David Garland join us. David, or Professor Garland, is the Arthur T. Vanderbilt Professor of Law and at the School of Law, and also Professor of Sociology at NYU's Department of Sociology. Professor Garland is the author of a series of award-winning books, including Punishment and Welfare, A History of Penal Strategies, Punishment in Modern Society, A Study in Social Theory, The Culture of Control. Literally, I could be here for the rest of the day if I were to go through all of these books. These are amazing texts that have really helped us to understand the institution, both as it exists in the US and in some cases outside of this context. Professor Garland has been elected to membership of learned societies in both the US and the UK, being a fellow of the British Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Professor Garland has been a Davis Fellow at Princeton University's History Department, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow at Stanford Center for Advanced Study. He has been awarded doctorates from a few different universities across the globe. And in 2012, the American Society of Criminology awarded him the Edward H. Sutherland Prize for Outstanding Contributions to Theory and Research. His he was Shimizu Visiting Professor at the London School of Economics in 2014 and is currently a Professorial Fellow at Edinburgh University Law School. His current work focuses on comparative explanations of America's distinctive use of punishment and on the genealogy of the idea of the welfare state. His most recent book is The Welfare State, A Very Short Introduction, which was published in 2016. Welcome, Professor Garland, to the Program in Criminal Justice speaker series. I, for one, really wanted to have Professor Garland join us because of the, I think in some ways what I would think of as a unique contribution to the conversations about how we would want to think about reimagining community. Professor Garland, we had here a couple of weeks ago, the DA of Suffolk County, Rachel Rollins, and I asked her what role should prosecutors play in helping to construct or reimagine community safety? And she said, and really, what do you think of as community safety? And she said, you know, I don't really think this is about prosecutors. Communities that are safe are communities that have great schools, they have good parks, they have, you know, these are solid communities that are well supported. And essentially what she was saying is that these are communities that are well supported by a strong welfare state. It's a part of the conversation I think that we rarely have. And so I really wanted to hear your voice on this issue. So what's going to happen? You are the rare academic to choose a conversation over a talk. And so we have a conversation instead of having you give the talk. I will ask a set of questions and then turn it over to my colleague, Chris Winship. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A with the audience. I will remind everyone to keep their questions short, so we can get as many people in as possible. And in instances where you might not be asking a question at all, or your question's going on a bit too long, I might have to intervene so that we can move things along. Professor Garland, let me start by actually mentioning that in addition to being one of the top scholars on the question of crime and punishment, you are also a top scholar of the welfare state. So what I would like you to do to help get this conversation started is to briefly share your perspective about how we might understand the relationship between the development or evolution of the penal system and that of the welfare state.
So, well, thank you very much indeed, Sandra. And choosing to have a conversation rather than give a presentation, I thought that would be kind of more enjoyable for me as well as for you. So also less preparation, I guess. But so the welfare state has typically been studied by criminologists, people interested in criminal justice, historians of criminal justice, by really asking the question, how has criminal justice been changed by the rise and eventually by the kind of decline of welfare states, right? So beginning probably with Michel Foucault's work, This is When Punished, 1970s, there's a sense that the way that criminal justice understood who the offender is, how the offender ought to be treated, what responsibilities the state might have by way of reform or investigation of the person's social background or psychiatric state and the delivery of services. That really begins in the 19th century, late 19th century particularly. And Foucault talked a little bit about that. He talked about how judges shifted from being about kind of who were lawyers handing down sentences, and they became kind of doctor judges, social work judges, psychiatric judges, because there was a blending of social considerations and penal considerations in the same sentencing process. So that, when I was a PhD student, that seemed to me really interesting. So I posed the question, how did the emergence of the British welfare state at the turn of the 20th century, how did it reshape criminal justice? And the answer was actually it did in a remarkable number of ways, particularly introducing things like the indeterminate sentencing system, whereby people would be sentenced for an open-ended period of time because the expectation would be to be treated and be reformed, they could be released early, and if not, they could be kept in longer. Things like probation becoming a state function, parole, supervision of offenders, social work backgrounds, reformatory institutions, all of that was the impact in the criminal justice system of the larger context of a welfare state where the kind of social contract between government and citizen had been transformed, and there was a sense of government becomes responsible for security and welfare and provision. Now, the second phase of historical studies of welfare and punishment, welfare and criminal justice was really about the period from the 1980s onwards. Books I've written, The Culture of Control, books other people like Jonathan Simon have written about poor discipline. These were studies that looked at what happened when there was a retrenchment of welfare state spending and welfare state ideologies, what happened when there was a kind of neoliberal move away from the New Deal or from the welfare state. And of course, the answer was that things like prison programs, education, training, rehabilitation were curtailed and almost often defunded, that the purpose of sentencing shifted once more to be retributive and incapacitative rather than reformative. And so that kind of, how did welfare state and criminal justice co-evolve, has been a story of the rise and fall of welfare and its impact on criminal justice. But notice all of these studies are really about the interior, as it were, institutional life of the penal system and sentencing system. The larger question about, what happens when a nation has a welfare state in terms of crime and punishment? What happens to levels of violence, for example? What happens to levels of incarceration? That kind of study wasn't in the remit of the historical work that I did or that other historians did, but it's been front and center of comparative penology and comparative work in political economy that's been done really in the last 20 years. And there, the analysis looks interestingly different. There, the issue is there a correlation between types of welfare state, for example, the Nordic social democratic welfare states or the continental conservative democratic welfare states, or the ones in the Anglo-American sphere like USA, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, which are liberal welfare states in the sense of market-oriented welfare states? Are these different kinds of welfare states correlated with different penal regimes? And the very strong finding has been, yes, they are, that the more generous and extensive the welfare state, the less punishment, the less imprisonment there is. And indeed, Bruce Western, your former colleague at Harvard, and Catherine Beckett did a study of the 50 American states, looking at these two institutional domains, the welfare spending and penal incarceration levels, and they found the same inverse correlation, that the more welfare spending, the less incarceration. So that's been the kind of framework, historical and comparative, that people have been developing, myself included. The big question that it throws up in the end, and this is something I'm working on just now, is basically, if it's the case that nations with large, generous, comprehensive, universalistic welfare states punish less, imprison less. Why is that? What exactly is the mechanism? Is that just an ideological or a cultural thing, that these are, more solidaristic nations which have kind of, an attitude towards the offender that treats him or her like a citizen and provides them with welfare support rather than expelling them like a dangerous enemy? Or is this really a story about crime and about violence and about disorder and social problems? Is it the case that the welfare state shapes not just punishment, but shapes social organization, and particularly the social organization of poor neighborhoods? Like what are the levels of violence in these neighborhoods? What kinds of forms of disorganization, drug addiction, suicides, failing families, teenage pregnancies? All of these things turn out to be highly correlated as well with welfare state type. And of course, it won't surprise you to know that the USA, which both for the poor, but also more generally for working people, has one of the least generous, least extensive welfare states, particularly if one excludes, as it were, corporate welfare. It's no surprise to find that in the USA, neighborhoods are more disadvantaged, neighborhoods are more disorganized, neighborhoods have higher rates of social problems than pretty much anywhere else in the developed world. And it seems to me that that's a fairly direct consequence of the nature of the labor market and the lack of employment protections, the lack of support for families, and the hands-off character of state policy with regard to the urban poor in particular.
Well, thank you for that. It almost feels like you set up your response in such a way that predicted my next question, which is around race, in part because so much of what you ended your response with correlates highly with how folks describe low-income communities of color, especially Black communities. So many argue that both the evolution or devolution of the penal state and especially the welfare state is intricately linked with race and racism, right? So we talk about the welfare state, the US's kind of delayed development, how stingy it is, how harsh it is, and also its penal state, how harsh it is, et cetera, is linked to a history and really, frankly, a contemporary period of racism. This is about race. It's about the desire to exclude from society's resources, all these things that you described, a population that has been deemed undeserving and worthy of harsh punishment. So I have to ask, how has this past and its current manifestations informed patterns of crime and punishment that we see today?
So that's a hard question. I mean, there's no institution in this country from our 18th century and as amended constitution through to political economy, to the character of the education system, the character of the culture, character of the labor market. There's no institution that hasn't been shaped by the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation, and the continuing racial hierarchies which have survived civil rights movement, survived Reconstruction, survived constant efforts to rework that racial balance. So absolutely true to think that the welfare state in this country and also the penal system in this country are both shaped by racial legacies and ongoing racial discriminations and characteristics. However, I want to talk about the welfare state in the way that non-Americans talk about it. In other words, not welfare for the poor, social assistance, temporary assistance for needy families, food stamps. When people say welfare, these are the things they think of. And these are heavily racialized. And indeed, the kind of vision of welfare and the welfare recipient in America is very, very deeply imbued with racial prejudices. And one reason why people are so harsh about that welfare population is precisely racially charged sentiments about the undeserving, feckless poor. But that aside, much of what one means by the welfare state is actually social insurance and public goods and employment protections and the management of the economy by government, right? I mean, so when one thinks about the welfare state and what it mostly means, it's about Medicare and about Social Security. And of course, in this country, these things are also very limited. They were limited. They had pretty clear racial exclusions early on in the 1930s. They no longer do in the same kind of ways. But that social insurance, public goods welfare state is also very limited, right? So we don't have comprehensive healthcare. We don't have family support. We don't have paid leave. We don't have employment protections. We don't have a government that's regulating the economy in the interest of securing employment for working people. Now, I think that that's to be explained less in terms of the power of white domination and race, and much more in terms of the power of business and capital in this country, which has often harnessed racial sentiments to kind of expand its base and to make the argument to Southern Democrats in the 1930s and since. But the primary explanation for why the American welfare state is as limited as it is on that larger level has to do with the kind of relationship between business, capital, and labor. And historically, the labor movement in this country has been much weaker, has often been undermined by government, often been undermined by police, in fact. But the limited welfare state in this country is mostly a success by the private sector and business, limiting employment protections, limiting labor organizations' powers. And in that smaller section of the welfare state, which has to do with public assistance outside the employment relationship, yeah, for sure, that's been heavily racialized and is very, disciplining and very conditional and very mean, and by and large, focused entirely on families and children, and therefore women, rather than on young men who might be outside the labor market, who have very little recourse to welfare. That's a largely racial story, but the larger welfare state characteristics are, I think, a political economy story. Never in this country separate from race, but not primarily about race in these respects. So that's the welfare part of the story. The penal system part. So there's two reasons why our criminal justice system is heavily, disproportionately punishing and incarcerating people of color, particularly young Black men. And these two reasons are, first of all, discrimination in enforcement. It's discrimination sometimes in the laws themselves, characteristically the war on drugs very much targeted and very much enforced in ways that jeopardize African Americans and people of color much more than drug dealing, drug smoking, drug using white people. So there's discrimination there in enforcement, sometimes even in the law. But there's also, and this is a big part of the story of criminal violence, there's also disproportionate involvement by young Black men in crimes of violence, particularly in homicides. And that too is a welfare state product, right? I mean, there's no reason to do with culture or morality that explains that. The reason is to do with the segregation and the concentration of poverty and disorganization and disadvantage in communities of color, which leads to higher violence levels here, it does everywhere, and ends up being, as it were, the people who are more involved, disproportionately involved in crimes of violence are poor people, and in this country that means poor Black people much of the time, and they end up being incarcerated more. So you have two, as it were, explanations. One to do with the background of what is shaping violence rates in this country, which are way higher than those of the other affluent developed nations. I mean, our homicide rates have been going down now for 20 years. They're still 3 times as high as Canada's. They're still, 5 or 6 times as high as Western Northern European nations. That's a political economy story. That's a story about economic exclusion, underserved populations with poor local labor markets, poor housing, terrible schools, families that don't have any support, and people ending up in trouble. So these are two stories. The other story that I want to just emphasize is we have, as everyone knows, in this country come to kind of blur and to combine notions of crime and dangerousness and notions of blackness and masculinity. And when people think about who's in prison, they think about young men of color, and they think of them in terms of dangerousness rather than in terms of, I don't know, citizens who are serving their time for a crime they've committed and who will be, as it were, re-entering society later. That kind of notion that people who are criminal and people who are prisoners are probably people of color and probably don't deserve any sympathy or any support, that I think must be part of the cultural explanation for why American sentencing law and American sentencing practice and American prison conditions are so awful. I mean, the extent of sentencing for crime, particularly for violent crime in this country, is just hugely excessive in comparison to Britain or comparison to Germany or the Netherlands or the Nordic countries. And that's the length of sentences, as well as the propensity to send people to custody rather than to give them monetary penalties or give them probation and community measures. That propensity to send people to prison for a very long time, and the willingness of the USA to tolerate that for decades, until very recently, no one complained about mass incarceration. It wasn't even a term people used outside of a small cadre of academics. That notion that we can happily, contentedly be indifferent to the suffering of people in prison, I think has to be a racial story in this country. Has to somehow connect to legacies of slavery and legacies of second-class citizenship and legacies of a toleration for people having, conditions of life which ought to be intolerable in any civilized society, but in this country have been tolerated for very long periods of time.
So thank you so much for that. So let's just for a moment switch gears, and then we'll get back to this question of race a little bit later. Even before George Floyd was killed by the Minneapolis police, there were many proposals put forward to address racial inequities in the penal system, including but not limited to police brutality. There have been calls for police abolition or some form of defunding, with additional attention paid to alternative forms of conflict resolution. Some have called for police and or policing reforms with a focus on police use of force rules, civilian oversight, implicit bias training, diversity and inclusion, etc. And some have called for additional resources for the police to be better trained, and there are sort of other reforms like this. So which of these proposals, given your desire for us to focus on what it is that a stronger welfare state can do to kind of, to support, stabilize communities, given that perspective, which set of these proposals, if any, would you be most optimistic about, and why, specifically with regards to changing the nature of the relationship that tends to exist between law enforcement and low-income communities of color?
And there's a lot in that question, a lot of different kind of threads one could pull and kind of possibilities one could talk about. I mean, the most visible issue in all of this, the police killing of civilians and the disproportionate killing of Black men by the police, that it seems to me is, first of all, it's something that's amenable to treatment by training. In other words, the likelihood of police officers shooting, likelihood of police officers using lethal force in an encounter with suspects, that's something that's amenable to being transformed by training. The NYPD's got its problems, but being a large force, it's also had some of these problems early and put in place training and processes and protocols. And actually over the last 20 years, there's been a marked and continuous decline in the extent of police shootings in New York City by cops, the number of times that they fire their guns, the number of times that they kill innocent civilians, any civilians, have been reduced primarily by processes internal to the police. That these are the kind of things that could be done right across this country, although God help us, I mean, we have an uncountable number of police departments. I mean, some people say 13,000, some say 15,000, 18,000. These are local jurisdictions with their own police commissioners or police chiefs and so on. And one difficulty of that devolved local character is many of these places are pretty amateurish. Many of these places do not have good training. Many of these people are spending all the time, you know, with short periods of poorly trained, poorly paid police recruits who are mostly focused on, you know, that we're not getting shot when they go outside. And so all they're doing is, as it were, learning to pull their guns at the first sign of trouble, which of course is a recipe for disaster. Interestingly, I mean, the US police compared to Western European, Australian, Canadian police forces are much more prone to shoot and kill, much more prone to shoot than any of these other police departments. Turns out, of course, they're also more prone to being killed. That's to say that the milieu in which American policing occurs, which is more violent and also more gun-laden, to make an obvious point, than that of, you know, continental European countries or Canada or Australia and so on, that makes a difference also to what it is that the police do and why they do it. So, I mean, again, that's a background story about social organization, about welfare, about violence, and it's a criminal justice consequence of a background set of problems that won't be solved within criminal justice. Let me make two other points about that. The relationship between the police and communities of color, by which people particularly mean, like, they don't mean Sag Harbor, middle class, quite well-to-do, historically black neighborhoods. There's no problem between policing in these. The problem that we're talking about are policing and poor neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are largely segregated, largely concentrated, cumulatively disadvantaged poor people, and also people of color. These are the neighborhoods where police show up most of the time, behave aggressively most of the time, end up conducting most of the brutality, the stop and frisk, random, massive level of it, and most police shootings occur there. One thing one could try and do about that, of course, in the kind of longer term background, is to stop having housing and spatial segregation in this country. I mean, that's a stunning feature of the American urban landscape, right? The extent to which in this country there's a concentrated segregation of poor black people, which end up being problematic neighborhoods in all sorts of ways, problematic in terms of the lack of, you know, jobs long term, the lack of decent schools, lack of decent housing, all of which end up being expressed in criminality, drugs, violence, and the police are called there more often. The police say that they ought to be there more often. The police's relationship with that community is therefore more hostile, intense, and one can only expect to find problems in that kind of setting. I mean, basically, policing is always problematic. But in America, it's excessively so because the police are poorly trained, the police are armed, and the police are often operating in what they regard as being hostile circumstances. One of the stories that one of the proposals that people make all the time is to defund the police. And that's a very powerful proposal, just like abolish the police. It seems to me that the problem is not the police are overfunded. The problem is the police are spending the funds they have on all the wrong things, on militarizing, on army grade, military grade weapons. That there's every reason to stop that kind of expenditure within the police. But the notion that we could, as it were, take police budgets and move them over to the social services, and that would be, as it were, sufficient to deal with crime problems, social disorganization problems, that's a very standard American, let's not spend any money, let's not tax, you know, property or capital or income for fear that, you know, it's politically unpopular. There isn't enough funding right now to ensure the proper level of healthcare, social services, housing, education, and so on. And that won't be made available just by moving police budgets sideways. The need in this family is my friend Adana Usmani, who I think is on this call, said, like, we shouldn't be defunding police, we should be defunding the rich. We should be taxing more extensively in order to fund social expenditures, some of which will go to police, more of which will go to social services, mental health services, schooling services, housing for the homeless. All of these kinds of things need to also be funded. And the police mission has to be scaled back, to be focused on the things that the police can do and no one else can do, rather than have the police dealing with, you know, people who are mentally ill and are off their meds and are not being supported, or people who are being homeless on the streets and are being moved on. So that's a long and not especially optimistic answer about where we will reform, where it will happen. But the whole emphasis of the kind of take I have on this is that criminal justice problems are amenable to short-term moderate solutions, but anything more extensive, anything that's going to be more fundamental, will actually involve going way beyond criminal justice to deal with the kind of, you know, the whole context of social support, social disorganization, social problems that our political economy reproduces again and again.
Thank you so much for that answer. I appreciate your willingness to kind of dissect the multi-part question that I asked. Because of time, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Chris, to ask his questions.
David, thank you for a really terrific set of comments. I think I'm in full agreement. So in the beginning, you talked about this association between the generosity of welfare and sort of the extent of the criminal justice system. And laid out two proposals. One, I guess I would say, is the degree to which welfare stingy states criminalize certain kinds of behavior, for instance, mental health, versus that stingy welfare states produce, say, more violent crime. Do we have any sense of the relative importance of these two kind of stories? I mean, both could be true, but.
So the two different kind of processes, right? So one is providing the services to deal with particular presenting problems. So we use jails to deal with mentally ill because we don't have public health system, and we don't have universal health care, and we certainly don't have universal mental health care. So that's a very direct comparison with nations where somebody who is presenting with mental illness needn't worry about being poor because there's, as it were, provision whether you're poor or not poor. It's not based on your capacity to purchase insurance. So that's a big obvious difference, and that's usually not the basis for comparison. The key thing people are comparing is it the case that nations that are better integrated in terms of able to move people through schools into jobs, able to secure people in the labor market, whether they're moving out of jobs across mobility between jobs even when they're unemployed, do they end up having lower rates of violence than the US does, for example? And the answer to that seems pretty clearly yes. I mean, the processes of generating violent conduct are clearly complex. They clearly involve everything from opportunity structures and legal and illegal economies to much more important in-depth psychological processes that have to do with the experience of infant and children and young people growing up in a context where violence is a part of the everyday life that they're experiencing. Now, I would say that violent environments where there are shootings, where there's domestic violence, where there's gang violence on the streets, where there's shooting by police, where there are homicides, where people who have died in your neighborhood, that is so much more a characteristic of the USA than it is of any Canadian or European or Australian nation or neighborhood. I mean, the level of violence, particularly lethal violence in this country, is just 3, 4 or 5 times as high. And of course, it's very concentrated. So to the extent that, in my view, most of the data suggests that rates of violence are certainly conditioned by, and one would want to say caused by, although the processes, as I say, are more indirect and more difficult to trace, the background level of economic and social security, provision and welfare, that I think is the set of mechanisms that are more interesting and difficult to tease out. That the one that you began by mentioning in terms of just differential availability of services, that's really very clear.
So you talked about segregation as being sort of a fundamental problem in the context of the US, and I certainly fully agree. Any thoughts about how we're going to deal with segregation?
So no, I'm not the person to come to as it were, offer proposals about how it is that, you know, both housing policies at the local level, public housing provision, desegregation by, you know, attending to zoning rules and local kind of property tax and property zoning arrangement. All of these things are really quite deep, detailed problems that housing experts have kind of views about, and, you know, talk to Doug Massey about it rather than talk to me about it. This is not an area of expertise that I have. So anything I'd have to say would be more or less like, clearly we're in a situation where historically over time, we've allowed segregative processes to accumulate and are now overdetermined, not just by, you know, rules about where people must stay, they've mostly disappeared, but more to do with the differential level of wealth that is distributed across households of different colors, and the capacity to, you know, pay a rent or to get a mortgage when you're in that kind of gradation of low income. So I mean, these are not easy problems to fix outside of quite large-scale transformations in the prospects for working people and working people of color. And these, of course, are not going to be fixed because some criminal justice proposal says without this, criminal justice will continue to be excessive. These are going to happen because working people and labor unions and, you know, God help them, the left of the Democratic Party, if it ever has any kind of grasp of power, are going to make happen for reasons that have nothing to do with criminal justice. I mean, they'll have down the road consequences upon the next generation and their levels of violence and their levels of encounters with police and so on. And, you know, one would hope that over time, the same pattern of the criminal justice system being modified, rendered more humane, rendered more progressive by a background commitment to more solidaristic social democratic institutions. But it's going to happen, you know, from the outside in with criminal justice rather than the other way around. I mean, right now, Black Lives Matter and Defund the Police and ending mass incarceration are politically prominent, but they will not be the basis for transforming like America's political economy and having a new deal. They might be the beneficiaries of that.
Fully agree. Why don't we open it up to questions from everyone else?
So Elsie Chandler.
Hi, thanks, Dr. Garland. I'm a public defender and I've worked and lived in Harlem for decades. It's my experience that the police reflect society at large, and an enormous amount of the oppression experienced, and I'm using oppression in a my clients wouldn't use that word, but is a function of the prosecution and the court system, which also reflects social will. Do you have a thought about that?
So in this country, mass incarceration is made possible simply by or only by the aggressive policies of prosecutors enforcing and implementing a remarkable array of sentencing laws which allow for just for overcharging and extorting guilty pleas as a matter of course, with a kind of like streamlining of the process of moving people from arrest into incarceration. So prosecution, which had been largely shaped by the law and order politics of the 1980s and 1990s, and which only now, like, you know, we're in a moment where, because lethal violence and homicide rates and crime rates generally have declined, the possibility of looking differently at policing and prosecution and imprisonment has occurred, and people are beginning to think, well, maybe we should have progressive prosecution. Maybe prosecutors should be one of the agencies that begins to moderate and reduce mass incarceration rather than reproduce it all the time. So clearly, changing what it is that prosecutors do is going to be a key part of any effort to, or any successful effort to, reduce levels of incarceration in this country. Because of course, the people in prison and the length of time that they're there are, by and large, they've had their ticket written by a prosecutor, you know, by an assistant DA who's just, this is the level of incarceration that's expected for this kind of crime. Why would prosecutors change? Well, prosecutors would change, first of all, if the political context was one in which people were critical of overpunishment, and they were operating in a context where crime rates and violent rates were relatively low, such that crime and law and order wasn't a kind of headline issue that dominated debates and dominated the tabloid press and the daily news and so on. So one of the key issues is going to be, if we persuade lawmakers and prosecutors to de-emphasize incarceration, reduce the number of people sent there, and reduce the length of time to which they're sent there, that, I think, is a sustainable policy only to the extent we also succeed in avoiding a resurgence of violent crime and homicides in particular. In other words, you know, prosecutors will reflect the changing mood of the country. Prosecutors will respond sometimes to new incentives that come from organized efforts to elect progressive prosecutors rather than aggressive ones. But the likelihood is that prosecutors will continue to do what you said at the beginning of your remarks, they always do, which is to, by and large, reflect the temperature of majority public sentiment in the areas for which they are representative.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. Perhaps Kathy Rebowl would like to ask her question.
So I'm very interested in your premise that we need to fix the inequities outside of the criminal justice system. But I guess my concern is that we have some issues with, like, for example, there was a recent study that came out, and I've known this before, but there's data now that shows the adults are, in the adult system, we're overcharging Black people. And I think, like, one advantage of overcharging someone is then they'll plea bargain. And if you're Black, you might be poorer and less likely to have a good lawyer. So I guess I'm concerned that I think we need to do, they need to be hand in hand. And we have to acknowledge that those systems, how do I put this? The system, you know, there was a show I watched recently, and it was about a prosecutor, and he had been found, many of his people had been found not guilty. He had been able to get wrongful convictions, and he was still working. He was working as a consultant for the DA's office. So I guess my feeling is we have to acknowledge that there's racism, there's straight up ugly racism, and it's sort of a hand in hand. That's where I'm coming from.
You're exactly right. That the standard charging process in, you know, district attorneys' offices all across the country is to utilize the capacity that law provides, and in this country, we've layered one criminal offence over another criminal offence because state and federal legislatures have been only too keen in the 1980s and 1990s to show how tough they are on crime, and typically are kind of duplicating laws so that the same fact pattern can turn out to be liable to be charged for 4 and 5 different kinds of offences. And prosecutors will do that. They'll kind of pile on these different separate charges for the same fact pattern, or the same wrongful act. And then the defendant is facing huge numbers of years in prison and is extorted into accepting a guilty plea to get a smaller number of years in prison, which is still 3 or 4 times as high as they would have been given in Canada for the same offence. So you're absolutely right. Prosecutors do indeed need to be reined in. They need to begin to set lower expectations for what the proper time served for whatever crime it is that they are succeeding in getting the defendant to plead guilty to. So legislation and prosecution, as well as sentencing, all have to be modified in serious ways before we begin to make an impact on the number of people in prison and how long they stay there. But one thing I want to emphasize is that if we decide not to send people to prison who we currently are sending, but to deal with them in the community, if we decide to let people out of prison early and not finish their incredibly long sentences, then that's a very good thing in terms of the prison population being reduced. I'm all for that. I think that's way overdue. We have a rate of incarceration of about 700 per 100,000. In the Nordic countries, it's 1/10 of that. In most of Europe, it's 1/7 of that. It's ridiculous. It's scandalous. It's immoral. However, I'm also very conscious that to the extent that we engage in like a large-scale decarceration, in the extent to which we let out of prison large numbers of offenders and send them home, that we're not sending them home, we're sending them onto the streets. We're not sending them into jobs. They have no jobs. We're not sending them back to families. Many of them have no families. Basically, if we decarcerate and release large numbers of people, or even if we shift our sentencing practice in a way that we ought to, and as it were, impose community service measures or monetary penalty measures or non-custodial measures of some kind, we have to realize that many of the people we're dealing with, many of the people who will be released, have no social support, have no economic support, have no employment or housing. In other words, unless we provide services for the re-entry population, we're just condemning them to be nuisances as homeless people, or to be petty thieves, or drug dealing, or stealing, or robbing. There's like every reason to expect that people who are released, who have an offending record and who are not supported, will have great difficulty staying out of trouble. In other words, you can only make a shift from mass incarceration to a much lower level of incarceration if you put in place the support mechanisms, which means housing and employment and healthcare primarily, to deal with the populations who are currently being locked up in jail and being dealt with, that's to say, segregated and excluded and forgotten about there. I mean, the American solution to a precarious labor market and that kind of a limited welfare state is mass incarceration. If we no longer use that immoral solution, we're going to have to put other ones in place.
So as a follow-up to that, before I hand it over to Felix, who is next up, I'd like to ask you a bit more about this question of mass incarceration. So it makes perfect sense that the state should support communities that it's helped to decimate because of its the expansion of the penal state. But there are 3 states that have reduced significantly its penal population: New York, New Jersey, and California. And I think significant being around 25%, give or take, for each of those states, within the context of about a dozen years, depending on which state. So that to me is a significant reduction, with no discernible increases in crime or any of the things that you've talked about. And they took different approaches. Some focused on the front end, some focused on the back end. So I mean, clearly you want to be careful who you release or where you release them to, because you can still release and then, release them into mental health institution or whatever it might be that they would need. But it raises the question of, what then constitutes large-scale decarceration? Because to me, cutting it by a quarter is not small, and without any of the impacts that you just described, at least not that I've read. So what would be considered kind of mass decarceration or large-scale decarceration? And it almost sounds like, and I just want you to correct me because I'm sure that I'm wrong, that it almost sounds like you're saying keep them until you create a system that you can transfer them to. But we've just had about an hour-long conversation where you just told us that this state is not the state that's going to do that. So I feel like we're just kind of rounding to the same place. This is
you're right. So Americans are constantly American public sector are constantly trying to do things on the cheap, right? So we would like to have a reduction in incarceration, but we would not like to spend any more money on providing social services or housing or employment prospects for the population that was previously incarcerated or would otherwise be incarcerated. So my claim is not to do nothing about mass incarceration. My worry is that if we accelerate, as we should, the process of decarceration, it won't be long before we reap the consequences in terms of increased crime. In other words, when one has to do more than simply let people out. Now you're absolutely right. The long-term, not very short-term, but long-term process of change in the New York City jail system has been one where people in Rikers Island used to be a population of about 20,000. Now it's about 9,000. If we manage to close Rikers, it'll be because we reduced it to 3,500. All of these things have been, the first stage of that development, having the population that are there in the New York City jail system, that's been successfully done, while simultaneously crime including violent crime in New York City, has continued to be reduced. That's exactly the kind of process, the parallel process that you'd want to have occur. In the state prison system, similarly, there's been a reduction over time. Now, the way in which these things have been managed, jail and prison are very different in these respects, right? So most of the jail population is being detained prior to sentencing, or is there, a third of them are there for misdemeanor sentences or a short time. So there's a huge turnover, a large number of people. And the key question is, do they need to be in jail while awaiting sentence, right? And there's a whole bunch of ways. And the primary worry you have is, one, will they show up? And two, for their sentencing hearing or for their court hearing. And will they in the meantime reoffend, or will they in the meantime tamper with witnesses and so on? These things have been managed by New York City's criminal justice system agencies in very effective ways, such that we're now looking at the prospect of a very radical and very welcome proposal for closing Rikers down, right? So, it can be managed, it can be done. It can particularly be done in a context where the economy and the social organization of neighborhoods are anyway also improving, that one's making the best of reductions in violent crime. And the fact that we've got such a huge reduction in New York City homicides, say, is like an immediate impact on the state prison population, because all these people who, in 1994, we had like 2,200 homicides every year in New York City. Last year, we had about 250. Every one of these years, in the 20 years, 30 years since, that all these homicide cases that did not result in somebody being sent for life imprisonment without parole into the state prison system and piling them up. So there's a very direct relationship there between reducing levels of violence and reducing prison population. It sometimes takes some time to filter in, because the people who are in prison now were often sentenced 10 or 20 or 15 years ago. But the possibility of managing these two things over a long term is feasible. But what we're mostly talking about with mass incarceration, it's not saying, yeah, we'll continue for the next 80 years, which is the pace we're currently on, to get to a level of incarceration that's still 3 times as high as the European one, right? So if anybody's serious about ending mass incarceration, they're talking about radical steps to release large numbers of people, as it were, overnight. And and my suggestion is that that's a great idea. Most people in prison needn't be there. Many people have served a very long period of time in prison. They should certainly be released, but we should also certainly provide them with the possibility of surviving and not on the streets.
Felix, you're up. Thank you, Dr. Garland.
Hello, thank you for your thoughtful words. I just wanted to ask a quick question about a comment you made about the kinds of social movements that would likely bring about the large-scale changes that people would be looking for in criminal justice spaces. And when you mentioned that the kinds of things that address the underlying inequality and segregation that really precipitate and allow these things to fester would be likely changed through a movement that has nothing to do with the actual concerns here, but be something that's like more broad-based worker movement or the Democratic Party or what have you, speaking to that. I'm just curious where that sort of framing comes from. And so it's thinking like, oh, it's not going to be Black Lives Matter or people who are activated through that channel who are going to be making change, but it's going to be these other kinds of things. I think, especially I'm curious, given that the scale of the problem is unique in the US. And so sort of the scope for this as an organizing principle seems like it also would be unique. And then I'm also thinking that the criminal justice system could act as a pretty big spoiler in trying to build the kind of broad-based working people's movement that would bring about these broader changes, both because police unions, prosecutors, law and order politicians, and others in general have political power and shape public opinion and see challenges to their positions and respond to them in kind, which is something that I experience a lot trying to push for reforms now. And also just the lack of action on the issues that are important to me and affect my ability to work and live in the world. If I'm in a coalition that doesn't take those things seriously, that makes me less likely to want to be in solidarity with those people. And it could be the sort of thing where people who could be natural allies are actually benefiting from the system or feel empowered to call the police in order to maintain their position. So I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit about how you think that might, matter here.
Right. So, you've answered your own question. I mean, basically, when there are mobilized groups around particular issues, and the question of who are the allies, who are the possibilities for coalition building with, and what kind of background issues are the conditioning factors that make the prominent foregrounded issue so pressing and so vital. These are questions about political coalition to political alliances, right? So if the civil rights movement in the 1960s becomes after a while an economic justice movement, there's a reason for that, right? And the reason is to do with, well, achieving equality before the law or achieving the end of discriminatory law and practice with respect to African Americans is not the same as providing them with jobs, right? So the need for civil rights to be realized with economic rights and civil rights to be backed up with economic justice and the prospect for, a good paying job, maybe a unionized job, that will enable people who've got civil rights also to have an economic stake and also to realize full citizenship as social and economic as well as civil. That's why, Dr. King is arguing at the end of his life for expanding the civil rights movement into a movement for jobs, right? So exactly the same thing you're describing. If it's the case that Black Lives Matter is focused immediately on police brutality or focused on mass incarceration or focused on the way the criminal justice system deals with, in a discriminatory, racist way, Black lives, then the question of whether or not the prospect of a movement for jobs or a movement for healthcare is one that is antagonistic and disruptive to that logic, or is actually supportive and extends that logic, that's a political tactic question. And it seems to me that there's no reason at all to suppose that criminal justice reform ought to be antithetical to or in contradiction to a movement for social democratic reform more broadly. Now, you're right, there will be specific tensions and contradictions. There might be some unions, police unions, prisons unions, that don't see that, that way forward for them. And it might be the case that there are forms of, sectarian and racial divisions that mark the labor movement or mark the Democratic Party and so on. All of these things are clearly vital, difficult, local, tactical problems, but they're tactical problems. The basic underlying notion that it's unlikely that American criminal justice will become like a normal criminal justice system instead of this extraordinary, exceptional, brutal and massive penal state. It's unlikely that it will get there unless these other social and economic changes are also occurring in parallel. And it seems to me that a movement for universal healthcare, or a movement for job protections, or a movement to make full employment one of the things that, and I don't mean by that, a job for everyone, but the job shouldn't pay the rent. I mean, good paying jobs and minimum wage jobs. It's unlikely to me that movement will come about primarily because people are concerned about police brutality or the state of people in prisons. But it's not in contradiction to these concerns. It's just not the same thing. They're connected in the background, the way that I was trying to indicate at the beginning of my remarks, but they're not the same political movement, and they won't be the same actors, hopefully. I mean, labor unions in this country, public sector unions in this country include large numbers of people of color. And one would hope this will be a multiracial coalition. If it's to succeed, it can only be that. But it won't be primarily one that's led by criminal justice activists. That's the thought I have.
Thank you.
So thanks to you both for that. So there are a number of comments in the chat that I think might be nice to bring into the conversation with Professor Garland. So I'm wondering if Judith Otto would be interested in sharing her thoughts or perspective or question.
Sure, thank you. I come into this as a person kind of on the periphery of all this and low level. I'm not a big policy person. I'm too old to go to rallies anymore. I'd get knocked over. But I do volunteer in prisons. And everything you said, David, about the legacy of poverty is what we've learned. We do a program called Alternatives to Violence, where I work with men, tell their stories, and it's clear that the great majority of them have had backgrounds of poverty. No fathers in the house. The fathers are in prison for all the reasons you've already talked about. And getting out of that is incredible. On the other hand, and this is relative to one of my comments, a statistic I've read is that 80% of people who do programs in prison do not come back. The recidivism rate among those who don't do programs is 80%, and that reverses for people who have. So that my work has been concentrated in that arena, because I come, as a teacher. So I don't know if you want to say anything about, it might be in the category of prison reform. It would be nice if we didn't need all of this, if people didn't get into prison, but the fact is we're dealing now with a huge rate of incarceration. So my focus has been to go where I can help those who are already there.
So, I mean, the work you do is very important. And one of the things that's kind of tragic about the federal government legislation in the 1990s was the cruelty of deciding that they would defund prison programs in the federal system. And of course, many states have done the same thing. So prison's like a very bad place to be. And anything that modifies and mitigates its hardships, anything that makes it into a positive experience rather than a purely negative experience has got to be a good thing, got to be something that people support. And teaching in prison, working in prison, medics working in prison, psychologists and social workers working in prison. These are all very important, very good things. Mostly, it's just that, it's kind of mitigating the pains of incarceration. And for some people, sometimes it will coincide with changes in their own lives. It might even spark changes in their own lives they can sustain when they're released. But it's not, I mean, we should think about it as humane and progressive and positive ways of dealing with an incarcerated population. We shouldn't think about it as a recipe for reducing recidivism. Because actually the numbers you gave are not, I mean, they would be great if they were true, but they're not sustained across the board. I mean, basically, it depends what you mean of being on a program. It depends how intensive the program would be. But there are no programs that have ever been scaled up that have been widely utilized in custody that have had that kind of 80% of people who do them never come back. I mean, essentially, people don't come back to prison when they get to a certain kind of age. In this country, there's a lot of revolving in and out of prison, in and out of offending. 2/3 of people rather than 20% of people do that. And there's no in-prison solution to crime. I mean, the only in-prison solution is the horrible one, that people get older and less able and less likely to commit crime. I mean, the solutions to crime control, the mechanisms of crime control, are mostly mainstream social processes about integrating, typically men, into families and jobs and homes. And anything that does that is preventative of crime. Anything that fails to do that probably isn't getting at the problem. But, that said, our prisons, they vary a lot across the state, they vary a lot across the country, but they could all do with more people provided with positive educational support, training support, support for their addiction, support for their difficulties, support for their histories of violence. All of these things seem like a good thing for prison, for sure.
Yeah, it would be nice if people had some of these advantages as children or young adults, right. Some of the programs that we run. Right. By the time it's prison, it's too late. Make a big difference. I had a little question, a small detail, and that is, in light of all the murders we've had of Black men recently, why the heck don't the police use tranquilizer dart guns?
Right. So I mean, they have tasers. They use tasers, and as soon as the taser doesn't work, they pull out the guns. Yeah, I mean, the holding police accountable for the use of violence, brutal violence, lethal violence, is something that can't happen after the fact by prosecuting and incarcerating the person who made the mistake or who did what they were trained to do, but it turned out that they made, they fired in the wrong direction and so on. That's how currently we're trying to deal with police brutality. We're trying to hold them responsible in the same way that offenders are held responsible. And it's largely an after-the-fact solution focused on an individual police officer who's liable to become an object of sympathy to a grand jury, is liable to get treated very differently from a regular offender, even though the crime is just as bad. But committing the crime in the course of the line of duty rather than committing the crime because you got to commit a crime are very different in the eyes of the public. Training cops not to pull their guns, not sending out cops to deal with people who are having florid mental illness difficulties or who are homeless or a domestic dispute or whatever, all of these would be good things. But the dealing with police weaponry has to be a training issue and a protocol issue within the departments. It can't be a kind of, what do we charge them with after they've made the mistake and someone's dead.
Okay, so we have 3 people up. Hopefully we can get through them in the time that we have left. First is Jake Horowitz, and then Morgan Benson, and then finally Frank Hartman. So Jake, you're up.
Thanks. I wanted to return to something you mentioned, Dr. Garland, about how crime can be a mediating factor between the welfare state and incarceration punishment. Over the last, 20 years, we've had almost consistently declining crime rates, pretty substantial, right? 50, 60%, depending on where you're looking. Right. And in some, and without at least a commensurate improvement in the welfare state in this country. And in some areas, that's translated into a pretty big reduction. Like the juvenile commitment rate is down 60% in this country. Hearing from Liz Glazer the reduction in New York City jails. So maybe I was wondering what you think about asking the question slightly differently, which is, why have some jurisdictions or systems resisted what would seem to be a natural decline in correctional control against that backdrop of declining crime?
Right. So first of all, it's not entirely clear that there hasn't been at the level of input into the prison system a decline. Remember, what your measure is not number of people sent to prison, it's the number of people who are in prison on a daily basis. And that is a stock that accumulates over time. And because the length of sentences in this country are so incredibly long, first of all, we have like 200,000 people serving life sentences. We have large numbers of people who are serving 20 and 30 and 40 years. They are in there now, not because they were sentenced in the late 1990s or 2000s. They're in there because of crimes that they committed earlier, right? So seeing the impact of reduced criminality and reduced arrests and reduced prosecutions is going in this country to be a lengthy one. That's the first point. Secondly, we have an astonishing sentencing mechanism in this country, which has to do with prior offenses. So in nearly every jurisdiction around the world, the notion that somebody's committed a prior offense or many prior offenses is going to make a slight difference to their sentence this time round. But typically it makes a slight difference. In the USA, it can multiply the current sentence by 3 or 4 or 10, right? So the people who are serving time now are often serving time which is operating, the sentence is a multiplier effect. So, you know, the ratio you'd expect to see between declining crime and declining prison populations is disturbed in its kind of one-to-one correlation by the time lag and the multiplier effect. So both of these are hiding the kind of benefits to the criminal justice system of reduced criminal behavior.
Okay, so Morgan, you're up next, and then last but certainly not least, Frank.
Hi, thank you so much for this discussion. I'm curious what you see as the potential for restorative and transformative approaches to justice.
So I think transformative and restorative approaches to justice are a very good thing. I think that with respect to the problems we've been discussing, namely the problem of mass incarceration and trying to reduce a prison population of 2.3 million to something that's more in line with other liberal democratic nations, that it's highly unlikely that expanding restorative justice will play anything very much of a role in that transformation. I mean, it in my view, ought to be extended, ought to become more a theme and to figure more prominently in the way that prosecutors respond to the arrestees that they're dealing with. But if you think about it, mass incarceration at the level of the prosecution is like a 20-minute decision making. Restorative justice, mediation, if it's to happen, is like a whole undertaking with large numbers of people, several people involved over time with, you know, coordination problems of bringing people together and managing the conversation and the mediation and its consequences and so on. In other words, it's a kind of quality justice which is intense in its kind of resource demands and which has really very little bearing on the way that the mass incarceration, you know, conveyor belt operates just now. So the two questions: should we have more restorative justice in these contexts where it can be embraced, can be something that the victims would agree to be part of, and where it's seen as being something that can either happen outside of a custodial setting, or even, of course, occur inside a custodial setting, which is not impossible. It seems like that set of questions is separable from the issue of managing the size of the prison population downwards. I mean, we don't have mass incarceration in this country because we don't have enough restorative justice. We don't have enough restorative justice and we have mass incarceration. The two things are separable problems in my view.
Okay, Frank.
Dr. Garland, you have a remarkable grasp of the issue at several levels, the theoretical level, but also I noticed what's going on the ground, the effect of prosecutors' decisions, the effect of police training. Do you see anything out there that given the Gordian knot that you described, do you see anything out there that gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that, so up until the year 2000, the only people who even knew that there were 2 million people in US jails and prisons were criminological experts, right? And people inside the system. And nobody else knew, nobody else cared. The fact that now everyone knows what mass incarceration is, that now that there are, social movements and bringing people out to the street concerned with police brutality and police killings, but also concerned with just the treatment of Black lives by criminal justice, which means mass incarceration. The fact that a best-selling book, The New Jim Crow, is something you'll go onto you'll stand in a train station or you'll get on a bus and you'll see people reading who've got nothing to do with university course assignment, but these are topics that people are concerned about. All of that gives me hope. In other words, the sense that there's now a public engagement of quite extensive kind that's critical and which is bearing on the up until quite recently hidden problem of how America deals with its criminal offenders. That gives me hope. I mean, it seems like it's a moment with real potential for progressive change. One of the things that motivates this conversation that I'm having and things that I'm currently writing is that making the most of realizing that progressive potential depends on not provoking a backlash and not suddenly finding that homicides are spiking, that there's a surge once more of violent crime, that cities that have become safe become unsafe, and that everybody thinks actually mass incarceration worked and weaponizing and militarizing the police worked because in the 1990s and 2000 they were going down, now they're going up again. We should return to that with a vengeance. That's what worries me, that the moment of hope and optimism that people out on the streets and people mobilizing around this issue provide us with needs to be kind of politically curated in some kind of way that will not produce the reaction that's too easily imaginable. Remember, law and order politics in this country began at the end of the war on poverty, just at the time when presidential commissions were arguing for massive reductions in criminal justice use, massive improvements in policing, and huge numbers of new public sector and private sector jobs to deal with racial injustices. And what did we got? We got Richard Nixon and 40 years of law and order. So I think we're at that moment again when we face potential for progressive change and we face potential for a reaction. And one of the things that we ought to do is at least inform ourselves about what these dangers are at the same time as we hope for and press for the progressive changes.
Well, I don't think that we can have a better ending to this conversation than those final words. Thank you so much, Professor Garland, for joining us today and sharing with us your thoughts. I completely agree with Frank that your understanding of this issue on multiple levels made this just a really fascinating conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for inviting me. Thanks for the conversation.